Good morning, everyone. How we doing after our festivities yesterday? What an event for those of you who attended, you know? So welcome to the panel discussion on nature-based solutions, environmental justice, and climate adaptation in urban environments on this occasion of the 30th session of the CEC Council. I'm the executive director. I think a lot of you have already met me. Somewhat recently appointed. This is my first council session. So if you're here for the first time, we're in this together. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional territory of many indigenous communities, but specifically the Lekwungen peoples, the Songhees, the Esquimalt nations. They're our hosts today, and we are on the lands that they have been on for hundreds and even thousands of years. And we extend our appreciation not only to be here, but to learn alongside the communities that are our hosts. Of all of the panels at this council session, this is my favorite one because I got to organize it. So really excited about this. The issue of local engagement, environmental justice, these are issues that are dear to my heart. I've worked on environmental justice issues for a better part of my life. And because we got such great speakers. The speakers on stage are individuals that either I know very well and highly respect, or that people that I very highly respect. So I think you've got a great set of speakers to engage on a discussion. You know, this is not just a series of presentations. It really is an effort to think about the challenges that we have, to think about how we bring climate action and environmental action to local communities and engage local communities and allow for the communities to lead us and to engage us on the needs that they have. So I'd like to start with a question that I've asked before in some of our encounters, which is, you know, why we're here. Why are you here? Why do you come all the way to Victoria, some of you from very far away, to engage in this discussion? I know why I'm here. I'm an environmental justice activist and have been for a long time. And we need to address inequity. We need to address the environmental problems we're facing, and we need to address the climate emergency. In 1990, end of the 90s, I founded an environmental justice organization in Latin America. Before we all were speaking about environmental justice as a thing. And I should clarify, the African-American communities in the United States had already been discussing environmental justice for some time with activists like Robert Bullard, who was at that time my inspiration for addressing this issue in the southernmost part of Latin America. But in Latin America, the dynamics were a bit different. And I remember at the World Conference Against Racism that got underway in the early 2000s, we came together. I guess that must have been one of the first times that EJ activist organizations came together to frame their discussion in the context of racism and discrimination. But some of the dynamics were different. And I remember those times as being ones in where indigenous communities, African-American communities, Latin American NGOs, at least in our pre-conference meeting in Latin America that took place in Santiago, Chile, we were trying to struggle to figure out how to frame this issue in our day-to-day work and in international forums. And I remember being on the plane with one of Robert Bullard's books, trying to figure out how to explain what we were doing in Córdoba, Argentina, with communities that didn't have access to fresh water, that were living on garbage sites, that had planes flying over their homes, spraying pesticides so that they could produce soy, and so that soy could be exported to other countries. Funny thing was, at the time, Argentina was the largest soy exporter in the world. And I don't think you could find a single Argentine that knew what a soy plant looked like. And so that was a big question we had. You know, we're exporting this product, we're killing people and animals, and destroying life for something that we're not even engaged with. This was our thinking at the time. But there was something clearly there that was unifying us. And then this vice president did this PowerPoint presentation. I think that was when we first started doing PowerPoints, and started talking about climate change. And it started waking people up to the fact that we were heating up too fast. Climate change was a real problem we had to figure out and solve. The scientists already knew that. This vice president, Al Gore, had figured it out as a politician, but the science already knew that we had a big problem. And we had begun to address the ozone problem long before that. And the scientists that did that, one of which, a very important man from Mexico, Mario Molina, was a key scientist in helping us solve the ozone problem. If it hadn't been for science going to policy and getting an agreement like the Montreal Protocol to phase out these pollutants, we couldn't go outside today. We don't quite understand how significant that work was. That really saved our planet. If it hadn't been done, you could not go outside today. That's how bad it was. And we are facing a similar situation right now with climate change, in which if things go as they are going, and they continue to go at the trend that they're going, we will not be able to survive in our ecosystems. And so somewhere in the mid-2000s, my human rights advocacy, human rights and environment advocacy, my EJ advocacy, turned to climate. And these people that were thinking about this climate emergency and the science as it was evolving really took front and center for me. And we started thinking about, how to tackle this climate emergency, how to recreate that response that we saw with the Montreal Protocol. How did we make that happen? How come countries came together all of a sudden and figured out that there was this planetary crisis of monumental proportions, and they got their act together to make this work? And right now, we're at that moment where we finally figured this out. For those of us that have been working on climate action for a decade or more, we knew that, but it hasn't been until now that everyone is kind of on the same page. We feel that we all agree that there's a climate emergency. Even the climate skeptics, well, not some of them maybe, but most people understand that we have to act quickly. And decarbonization, that's our buzzword. It's fine, but it doesn't change a damn thing. I could wave a magic wand and decarbonize the entire planet right now so we have no more carbon emissions, and it doesn't move the needle on climate. We keep warming. Carbon emissions, once they're up in the atmosphere, they keep warming the planet, and they will do that for hundreds to thousands of years. So if we all think decarbonization by 2050 is a great thing, we used to say 2100, well, 2050, that's great, but it doesn't fix the problem. And the problem is that we trigger tipping points long before. This is an image right here of what forest fires do. And I'm just going to explain very quickly. This is a forest fire not too far from here recently. And right below is a glacier not too far from here. When you have a forest fire like that, that glacier gets covered with soot. Got, probably a couple of centimeters of soot on the surface. You can see that right there. There's a person standing right in the middle there. Well, wear a dark shirt on a really hot day, you get hot. That's why you wear white when you go out in the sun. Glaciers, when they're dark, they get hot and they start melting. And when glaciers melt, the problems start happening. And as the ice melts away, it uncovers darker surfaces. So imagine you got rid of that glacier. Well, if the ground beneath it is either blue because it's water or it's brown because it's land, it will absorb heat just like this glacier is absorbing heat. And that's why, when you hear this in the news, but sometimes you don't think about it, the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than everywhere else. And this is causing enormous problems. We are not headed to 1.5C, which is the pathway that the Paris Agreement set for us to keep to. We're headed to 2.8. And in a 2.8 environment by the end of the century, we've got a problem. We're going to have more floods. We're going to have more droughts. We're going to have more inclement weather. Have you ever thought of the fact that when you're in Canada, northern Canada, and you look over to the right on the map, you got Europe at about the same level? Why isn't it as cold in Europe as it is in Montreal, where I was this winter, where it was 40 below zero? It's because of the jet stream, it's because of the air currents. And when those glaciers melt and change the salinity in the water, you get disturbances in the climate. And that could lead to a deep freeze in Europe. And that's part of the problem people have in thinking that it's just about warming. It's not just about warming. Every 1/10 of a degree matters. So anything we can do to stop those tipping points from triggering, those irreversible collapses from triggering, are going to make a difference. And they not only make a difference on climate, they also make a difference on the human suffering caused by the impacts of climate change. And this is why, again, extremely important. So pollutants like methane, black carbon, HFCs, these are many times more potent than CO2. And if you remove them today with that magic wand, and the magic wand is not actually magic, it's pretty easy solutions in the energy sector, in the way in which we manage our waste. These solutions allow for us to make great gains on pollutants that really help. And a lot of these pollutants also have extremely potent impacts on human health, on air quality. And that leads to all sorts of problems for our communities. So what does this have to do with our panel? That's the question. You know, this intro is about our problem, but cities are extremely important. Urban environments are extremely important. You know, I've had many debates with my wife, who works on some of the same issues we do, in terms of whether we need to mitigate or we need to adapt. Mitigate is solve the climate crisis by reducing emissions and maybe introducing certain actions that help cool. Or do we adapt? Do we help communities that are affected? Well, we need to do both, but doing both means you do less for each, right? So we have some pretty hard decisions to make. So it's really important that we choose wisely. We can't just choose any actions. We need to fix the climate problem. The house is burning and we need to get out and save everyone. But we also need to help those affected by heat, those affected by flooding, those affected by the extreme consequences of climate change. So if we can do both with the same action, you know, that's a great potential. During COVID, we learned a lot of things. At that time, a good friend of mine was at the helm of the California Environmental Protection Agency, and the governor had asked his team and society more generally to find ways to work on COVID, to address the COVID emergency, but at the same time, address climate change and address environmental justice, thinking about mitigation and adaptation. California is a state that, as some of you know, has done quite a bit on the issue of addressing environmental justice. The government and the legislature have passed laws and policy to do this, but it's also a place where activist groups, some of which are with us today, have done an amazing amount to mobilize communities, to mobilize society, to really engage and participate and lead and form and guide public policy. So coming from an EJ background, I was thrilled to start working with folks in California to tackle this emergency. And you know, that's where we are today. We really need to think about how best to address inequities and to work with local communities, but also through local government. You know, when we talk about reducing methane, and that the 3 ways to do this are energy, waste, and agriculture, you know, waste is a local problem, it's a city problem. Every single city in the world has a waste problem and can do something about it. And so if you're not engaging cities, if you're not engaging local authorities, if you're not engaging mayors, if you're not engaging communities, how do you address extreme heat? How do you address methane? How do you address quality of life? And, you know, I grew up in San Francisco, and just a couple blocks from my house, and I think I have a neighbor here in the room. Yeah. So I lived on Alamany Boulevard near Balboa BART Station, and there was a street 2 blocks from my house named Cayuga. Little did I know, Cayuga was a river that flowed right through the neighborhood. and it's been covered by cement. That's what we've done to our cities. We've covered our relationship with nature with cement. We've ensured that our kids understand nature as a park somewhere far from the city. I remember engaging with Stockton and thinking about ways that we could get inner city youth to get out to Yosemite, something they had never seen. This was one of the most beautiful places on the planet, just a couple of hours drive from the poorest neighborhoods of California. And these kids don't know Yosemite. They've never been there. The day you're there, you're just awed by nature. How can we protect nature or anything in nature that we've never seen? You know, that relationship with nature, and I think, and I hope that'll be part of the discussion today, is so critical to reestablish. And when we're talking with indigenous groups and their relationship with nature, for most people living in cities, they just don't understand that relationship because they've never lived it. You know, I've worked quite a bit on glacier protection laws. And one of the reasons that no country in the world has a law to protect the most abundant source of fresh water in the world with all the environmental laws that we have. No country in the world had a glacier law. Why not? Well, we don't protect what we don't know. We've never been to a glacier. How many people have been to a glacier? Maybe here, because you're in British Columbia, you've been to a glacier. But if you're living in Stockton, you've never been to a glacier. They're not that far away. They're right up in the Sierra Nevada. So this is the discussion that and I've lost my notes here. I don't even know where I am anymore. This is the discussion that we're going to have today. It's about cities. It's about urban environments. It's about bringing nature to cities. It's about the challenges of a municipal level governance system with communities that may or may not be related to their local council or their mayor. And how do we take this global climate policy and this emergency that we have and bring it down to the city level? Because just by the US or Canada or Mexico or any other country signing the Paris Agreement doesn't mean it happens locally. It doesn't mean that a mayor or a city neighborhood or an environmental organization that has something to help on climate change will get the support that they need to make this happen. Even in the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act, a ton of money, great, wonderful, that the government has devoted all of this money to climate. But how does it get to cities? How do cities engage? How do cities participate? How do cities get those resources and help lead? And so, final thought. We are all part of the solution here. I think everyone in this room is certain that you're doing something to help with the problem. I'm going to leave you with one rather bleak idea, which is whatever you're doing, it's not enough. It is not enough. If we're on a 2.8 pathway by 2100, it's game over. And we're on that pathway. We just heard it from our scientists. Secretary General of the UN is telling us we are not on the pathway we need to be on. So we need to do more. The good side, and I said it yesterday, is that we do have options. We do have solutions. You know, you put trees on a building where it's, and you know, we've done this, we've looked at this in Stockton, California with Matt here at the end of the panel. When it's 100 degrees outside, if you don't have trees in your neighborhood, it's 120. But go to the rich neighborhood where they do have trees, it's 85. It's cool. People live better. And sometimes the decisions we make, and I'll go to Mayor Alto and what she said yesterday at our welcoming ceremony, she's faced with those decisions every day. Where do you put the trees? If you're gonna, you know, here in this area, may not have AC because you never needed it. Well, now you need it. So how does a city address this issue? She said yesterday, I'm making our new city squares not to make them look good, but to make them cooler so that we have a cooling station for people who are too hot. And so as cities, you know, can you focus on these issues and through your codes and through your policies and through your engagement, do the right thing so that your cities are cooler, so that the people who most need help are getting it, so that we're being more equitable, and so that climate change is not impacting in worse and worse ways. And can we do it in a way to help solve the climate problem? So thank you very much. Thanks to the panel. We've got Evan Lloyd that's going to moderate and introduce everyone. Evan has far more experience than me as executive director of the CEC. He's got 2 years on me on that, and also has worked with the CEC for some time. And on these issues, he's well informed. He's also already intervened to model the agenda and to get us going. We've engaged very closely over the last several weeks to make this happen. So I'll turn it over to Evan, and I wish you the best during this discussion. I will say we will have a moment for questions, and if we do run out of time, I'm going to try to start this thing called the Executive Directors Panel. And this is the first edition of it. And I promise any questions you have that don't get answered, I will answer them personally. So I'll be here for a little bit to join you in this discussion, then have to run off to the ministers, but I will be following very closely. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Try to move this along. We do have a lot of speakers. We'll have a lot of interest, I'm sure. And so we're going to try and keep the agenda as tight as possible. Having said that, however, I do want to make a couple of remarks with respect to the business at hand. You will maybe notice at some point during the morning that some people will leave the room. It's not because we've necessarily stunned them, but they have other meetings that are running concurrently that they have to attend to. The other point I would like to make is that for those of you who feel the need, a couple of our panelists, I'm sure, will be speaking to you in Espanol. And so if you need to take advantage of the interpretation devices, please be aware of that fact. I guess the only other thing is I'm here to introduce Doug Smith, who will be our keynote speaker to start us off on some of the specific issues at hand. I did want to make a couple of contextual remarks in following Danielle, and that is just to note that here in British Columbia, today marks the 2nd anniversary of the terrible heat dome that descended upon Western Canada. And on this day, June 29th, 2021, excuse me, the village of Lytton in British Columbia experienced the hottest temperature ever recorded in Canada. It peaked at, I think it was 129 degrees Fahrenheit, 40 something Celsius. The next day, June 30, the village of Lytton burned to the ground. 90% of the structures, 2 people died, and in less time than we have dedicated to this panel here this morning. So this is, this is not something in the future. This is happening now. It's happening in British Columbia. It should also underline the fact that Lytton and surrounding Indigenous communities were evacuated. It was a significant issue. And at the end of this terrible heat wave, heat dome, over 600 people had perished in British Columbia alone with respect to the impacts of this. And, I could go on. You obviously know last week, New York City recorded the worst air quality in the world. Days later, Montreal joined that dubious club. And today, as we speak, the same phenomenon is happening in major centers across the United States, all due, of course, to raging wildfires here in Canada. So anyway, I'm here to introduce Doug Smith. Doug is the Deputy General Manager for Planning, Urban Design, and Sustainability in the City of Vancouver. He has long and broad municipal experience, including the outcome-driven actions across the spectrum of critical urban initiatives and priorities, including climate change, emergency preparedness, resilience, housing, affordability, and public health. So Doug, I'd like you to take it away and get us started. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Evan. I appreciate the introduction. As Evan mentioned, I'm Doug Smith from the City of Vancouver, and I'm very excited to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. As a conversation starter for our panel today, I'm going to provide an overview of nature-based solutions in urban situations, essentially cities. And I'm going to use the City of Vancouver as an example as we move this forward, but really the pieces that I'm talking about today will be applicable for almost any urban center. Oh, and our air conditioning is kicking on, so I'll even speak louder. So I'm going to start off with land acknowledgement from the City of Vancouver. So I live, work, and play in the City of Vancouver, and That is located on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and we're very grateful to be guests on this land. And this recognition is really of particular relevance for this particular conversation, because one of the reasons we don't have a robust natural ecosystem in our city is because of colonial practices that we really need to undo. So for some context, the City of Vancouver's got a long history of climate work, but on September 27th, 2019, we had a climate strike. We had a protest that started at City Hall, and there was over 100,000 people that showed up at City Hall and marched to downtown Vancouver to basically protest that we were not doing enough climate action at every level of government, but specifically demanding more work from the City of Vancouver. And within a year, we had developed our Climate Emergency Action Plan. So the Climate Emergency Action Plan, really, it includes multiple approaches to climate mitigation and adaptation. And on the mitigation side, we talk about building more complete neighborhoods, more complete communities where people can live and work and play within a walkable distance, a 15-minute city. And this is done in Vancouver's context through more density in our very, very big single-family neighborhoods by adding more density like this building you see here. We're also spending a significant amount of energy to do more infrastructure on everything from bike routes to pedestrianized areas that people can walk easier, to significant transit. We're building a large subway through the city at this point right now. And recognizing that people will still be driving, even though we're going to try to move as many people into a mode split for walking, biking, and cycling. We're providing EV charging all over the city, plus we're requiring every new building to have electric vehicle charging required as well. And then our biggest source of GHGs in Vancouver is our buildings, heating and hot water in the buildings. So we're requiring that all new buildings are built to essentially zero emissions. And in Vancouver's context, that means electrification, pretty well 100% electrification for new buildings. And we're starting to transition existing buildings in that direction. So that Climate Emergency Action Plan on paper looks like this kind of overview you see here. And what I'm going to focus on today is Big Move 6, that we call these our big moves, which is focusing on natural climate solutions in the urban environment. I'd also like to give credit to Tamsin Mills. She developed this Big Move 6, the natural climate solutions for the city, and did a fantastic job at it. So what this means from a carbon reduction perspective, and I'll get into the adaptation in a second, but from a carbon reduction perspective, if you think of the black arrow as being all of our sources of greenhouse gas pollution, carbon emissions, vehicles, buildings, industry, agriculture, and then you have carbon sequestration, which is the way the natural world breathes. Just like humans breathe out carbon dioxide and breathe in oxygen, the natural systems breathe in carbon dioxide, breathe out oxygen and a little bit of carbon dioxide, but most of that carbon dioxide is held and sequestered in the land, in the soil, in the trees, in the wetlands that we have. A really important factor here, though, is we can't use one to offset the other. We can't increase industry and then just plant a few trees. You have to think of the carbon sequestration potential of our green systems almost in terms of cleaning up historic pollution. So I'll give you an analogy. If I decide I don't want to pay for my garbage pickup anymore, I could just start dumping all of my household garbage into the street in front of my house. At some point, the city, as well as all my neighbors, is going to tell me to stop dumping that garbage. That's the black line there. We need to stop dumping our carbon pollution into the atmosphere. But I still need to go pick up the garbage I've been dumping in front of my house for the last 100 years, which is really what we need our carbon sequestration to do for our natural systems. We need to pull out that 100 years of historic carbon pollution we've been dumping in the atmosphere. So just for another context piece, I'm going to show you, sort of walk you through City of Vancouver's thinking with respect to our carbon pollution and our sequestration. Within the city boundaries and within control of what we have within private land, public land, parks, streets, everything, we feel there's about 16,000 tons per year of carbon sequestration that is happening right now. So the trees, the soil, the green spaces are pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in the city of Vancouver. So that seems like a fairly decent number. What we did, though, is we looked at the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and their recommendations for carbon capture and sequestration. And based on Vancouver's historical pollution, we calculated we need to pull 250,000 tons of CO2 per year out of the atmosphere to compensate for 100 years of Vancouver's historic carbon pollution. So even if we were to take our current number, which is about 16,000, and add as much as we can within the city boundaries, we're only adding maybe 5,000 tons additional. So that's a little over 20,000 tons. So that's about 8% of what we really need to do to meet Vancouver's obligations with respect to pulling out and sequestering carbon. This means we need to work with partners outside of the city of Vancouver. We need to work with partners in our region, other cities who have more space. We need to work with agriculture and farms. We need to work with landowners. We especially need to work with groups like First Nations to restore forest and wetlands to basically deal with Vancouver's historic carbon. Now, this is just one city. I think we actually need a broader approach where either provincial or senior levels of government or even the federal government look at all of the cities that are producing the most of the carbon, but also are economic drivers and housing spots for the countries, and then look at the rural areas that are opportunities for dealing with that historic carbon and coming up with a system where we can compensate and pay for that. So natural climate solutions are one way to deal with carbon, but they do so many amazing other things, especially in an urban environment. So I talked about the carbon you see on the left there, but the adaptation and climate resilience component of this is incredible. It will help us manage our heat. It reduces drought risk. It reduces flood. It reduces our fire risk by keeping things green. It improves our air quality, our water quality. It increases biodiversity. And biodiversity isn't just about plants and animals. It's about us. We're part of the ecosystem. We're part of the biodiversity. Human beings need access to green space for their physical health and to their human health. There's also a significant equity component associated with natural climate solutions, both in the building of the natural solutions, whether it's hiring lower income or people who are seeking work to do the actual work, but also to ensure that there's equitable distribution of these ecosystems. Before I go into an example of that, I also, under the adaptation side, I do want to recognize the Canadian government for announcing on Tuesday their national adaptation strategy. Fantastic to see it. I reviewed it the other day. And what made me really happy was there's also an attached action plan. We have lots of strategies, but we need action. We need budgets to do the work. And I was very pleased to see the attached action plan as well. So an example of climate equity in a very, very local Vancouver context is the heat dome that happened 2 years ago that was just brought up. So in Vancouver's context, we had neighborhoods that you see there, our downtown east side, where the temperature, the wet bulb temperature, was close to 45 degrees Celsius. So this was extremely hot. The downtown east side is the lowest income neighborhood in Vancouver and also the lowest income neighborhood in Canada. Whereas you look at neighborhoods like Shaughnessy and Dunbar, where the temperature there was closer to 35 degrees. That 10-degree change in temperature is massive when you're talking about human health and the impacts it has on people. Then you throw in the fact that we have people who are living in small single-room apartments without air conditioning, without airflow, compared to someone who might live in Shaughnessy who probably has air conditioning. And if they don't, they could probably even go rent an apartment or go rent a hotel room if they really needed to get away from the heat. So there's a massive equity impact just because of the way we've designed our cities, where we've put our trees, where we've put our green spaces. So equity, mitigation, and adaptation are really critically interlinked, and natural climate solutions pull all three of these together. So if you're working in any one of these, you need to actually work in all four of these areas to understand the interplay and look for the opportunities to maximize your outcomes associated with all four of these. When you're building natural systems in a city, it's not easy. There's always lots of competition, but there's some principles that we're trying to follow in Vancouver. One of them is you need to put it near people. Like I mentioned earlier, human health, especially mental health, is so critical being next to nature. You need to build your nature that's accessible to people. This is also important, as Daniel mentioned earlier, because people won't support things they don't understand or don't see. So if you want them to support your policies and your budgets associated with nature, you need to put them near nature so they can appreciate it and realize how valuable it is. Nature needs space. You need room for creeks and streams and trees to actually thrive and grow. You can't jam them into small little areas. So you have to make space in cities, which is tough to do. Nature needs to be diverse. You can't just have a monoculture. You have to have multiple different pieces of it for it to be successful. It doesn't recognize boundaries between private property, public property, between cities, different cities. You need to work with all of the different partners and groups to be successful with your natural systems. It needs interconnectivity. It can't be just a singular place. Animals and even biosystems need to be able to move. And it's very, very complex. So you need to bring in experts. This isn't just someone who knows how to plant trees. You need to bring in all the people who understand the systems to come up with good ideas. So in response to this, the City of Vancouver is developing an environmental land use plan. And one of the things that I find really interesting about this plan is it's watershed based. It's not looking at boundaries. It's not looking at neighborhoods. It's looking at where nature wants to go, where the water goes, where the natural systems want to work. So we're building it off of that. It's a long-term plan, but the fact that we're actually developing one is a really critical piece for us. And within this plan, we're already starting some early work on private land. So this is privately held land. We're updating our tree bylaw to make it more difficult to remove trees. And when trees are removed, we're charging a significant fee so we can afford to plant additional trees in other places where we have space. We're going to be more flexible with our land use planning to allow people to work with nature and around nature as they develop their new buildings. And we're going to work with businesses to try to catalyze action there. There's significant movement by businesses to do great work there, but we think we can do more. Some great examples in the United States are where they charge a rain tax, where essentially businesses need to put in natural climate solutions to manage the water, or they're taxed on their hard surfaces on their property. On private land or public land, the city-owned land, parks and streets, we're updating our urban forest strategy. We're rewilding our areas. We're getting away from just your traditional grassy parks and moving into more wild areas that are not only more biodiverse and healthier, but they're actually less expensive to maintain. We're putting trees in those equity zones in those downtown east side areas where we had that heat issue and areas where schools are getting too hot. And we're putting in supporting actions, dedicated funding, soil guidelines. Cities rip up a lot of soil and put a lot of soil back. We need to know the right kind of soil, not to just to sequester carbon, but to support all the biodiversity associated with it. And we're doing a very detailed inventory of all the current natural assets we have so we can protect them and enhance them. Here's just some examples of some of the pilots we're working on right now. And you can't see the details, but there's a lot of those streams that are shown there. Those don't exist now. Those are streams we would love to daylight sometime in the future. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug. Just a couple of other business items as we get into this. In a short period of time, I'm going to ask each of our panel members to respond briefly to the presentation that we've just had. The discussion that we're going to have this morning is broken down into 4 thematic clusters. I'll be introducing those, but first I'd like to introduce our panel as well. So thank you, Doug, but I'd also like to introduce, going down beside us here, Deborah Carlson, who is a staff lawyer at the West Coast Environmental Law. She works on the Green Communities program there. She works with communities in British Columbia to support stewardship of land and water for community and ecosystem health, including ecosystem-based measures to adapt to climate change. Next to her is Dr. Mario Duarte Villaleo. He's the Director of Environmental Culture and International Affairs for the Ministry of Environment for the City of Mexico, which, in case you haven't been counting, is probably a population equal to or even greater than that of Canada. So a very significant entity indeed. Mario is, as I mentioned, the Director of the Environmental Matters for the City of Mexico, but he's also responsible for international cooperation in environmental matters in city networks that are international in nature, such as the C40 and ECLE, amongst others. He's also in charge of cultural policy and environmental education, and he has represented the CEC, or represented Mexico for various multilateral organizations, including the CEC, so long experience in this space. Next to Dr. Duarte is Jack Jacqueline Patterson. Jacqueline is the founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project, which is a resource hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership. She's worked on gender justice, racial justice, economic justice, and environmental justice with several organizations, and has served as senior director of environmental and climate justice at the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, for over 11 years. Next to Jacqueline, we have, where am I? Javier Garduño Arredondo, who is a specialist in planning, mobility, and urban development, and was head of planning at the Ministry of Agrarian, Territorial, and Urban Development in Mexico from 2018 to 2022. And since December of 2022, has been working for the Resilient Cities Network as lead for Latin America and the Caribbean. His experience is in the government sector, including servicing as a policy director for the Institute of Transportation and Development Policies in Mexico, and he prepared the country's first financial budgetary analysis of federal funds dedicated to urban transport and accessibility issues. And finally, last but not least, Matt Holmes, who is a coordinator with the statewide California Environmental Justice Coalition. He's worked on a number of air quality EJ strategies for cities in California, including Stockton and Richmond. His engagement included environmental justice advocacy in collaboration with Little Manila Rising, a nonprofit serving South Stockton and Inner Delta, and throughout the San Joaquin Valley. I hope I pronounced that correctly. A nonprofit serving South Stockton and the Inner Delta and throughout that valley, based with the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition. He also serves as a member of the California Air Resources Board Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, and has developed education and training programs focusing on urban conservation, workforce development, and citizen science strategies. I'd ask you to welcome our panel this morning. So as mentioned, each of our panelists will have an opportunity to respond briefly to the general presentation that Doug has provided us with. And then we're going to break into a shorter section of 4 thematic possibilities that we should like to discuss with the council. I would underline that for both our panel members and for anyone who's participating here this morning, to just note the fact that the CEC is predicated upon a federal association, the cooperation of the 3 federal governments of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And it's a bit of a stretch for them to get their head around engaging subnational governments, as they refer to them, be they states, provinces, or in this case, municipalities. And it's, I think, helpful for all of us to focus our remarks and our thoughts on the extent to which it will be possible to encourage our federal governments to facilitate or engage with subnational governments in a way that is coordinated and effective across the continent. So I'd ask you to keep that in mind with your remarks and thoughts. So with that, I'm going to turn over to the panel, and I'll just start with you. Thank you.
Everyone, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here in Victoria on the territories of the Kwanghan-speaking peoples, and having this really rich opportunity to listen and learn more this morning from the panel members, and you, and also having been here yesterday, it was really great, and very, very thought-provoking and interesting. So I'll keep it maybe to one idea for the opening here, but for context, we heard yesterday from Indigenous leaders and knowledge holders who shared, some Indigenous perspectives on land and water management, and gave some glimpses of the refined practices and knowledge that support long-term success, surviving and thriving on Turtle Island or North America. And one thing they really stressed was the need to plan for future generations. And I think everyone can hear that and say, yes, of course we have to plan for future generations. But are we really doing that in the, in the mainstream? Are we actually planning for future generations? So I take this advice from yesterday very, very concretely, and I think we should apply it with some rigor, particularly because we're in a time when we need to change direction. We need to be really mindful of where we're going. So I would suggest, and as we've heard, local governments do plan. They do develop community plans. They do develop long-term strategies. But I think they should be making longer-term plans. And I think they should be doing it in cooperation with the Indigenous peoples and the First Nations in whose territories they're operating. And of course, that plan making should be grounded in good community process. And I think we'll hear more about that from other panel members. So this isn't a replacement for short-term planning, but it's securing a point on the horizon so that we can keep reevaluating if we're making progress or not. It would keep us honest. And it would also free up some opportunity to have a bigger solution space. Some things that might be really challenging to take on in the moment, in a longer term, like for example, relocating communities. If we have a longer term horizon, we can start to think about that. It can also focus us in on what we need to do in the short term versus the long term. We need to protect people from these extreme heat events, for example. That's urgent. Many people died, as we heard, and many people suffered. And we're not that much better prepared for the next big heat event. So we need both, but I think we need more emphasis on long-term planning. And from the point of view of what the federal governments, what the national governments can do, they can support that. They can help provide some of the information and the funding that's needed. Here in our jurisdictions, we need regional environmental assessments, so we have accurate information to plan on. It'll also support more sub-regional and regional cooperation if we're engaging in these planning processes. So that's what I wanted to contribute on. Thanks.
Bonjour, good morning, buenos días. I'm going to speak in Spanish, so if you wish to use your translator, please feel free to do so. En primer lugar, muchísimas gracias.
First of all, thank you to the CEC, Daniel, Natalie, Evan. I'm so glad to meet you again. So yes, the presentation we just saw with Vancouver City's example reminds me of what we have done in Mexico City. Let me tell you that Mexico City has a sort of an identity problem. Although it's called Mexico City, it is not a city, it's a state. So Mexico City is actually a state. It has a second level of government. We have three in Mexico: the federal government, the state governments, and the municipal governments. Mexico is part of the second level. In Mexico City, there are 16 areas with a mayor for each. So mayors have the same level as a governor. So it would be wrong to say that Mexico City has a mayor. We have a governor. And so that complexity makes us work differently with those 16 different areas, but also with the level of the federal government. Mexico City, at a national scale, is a fourth of the GDP. You can imagine the impact of Mexico City for our nation's economy. It's also one of the richest cities in the world. In spite of this, there's a lot of inequality. So the first thing Claudia Sheinbaum did as a mayor was to say, let's break inequality between the east and west side of the city. If you can picture Mexico City, it resembles a drop of water. Half of it is a green area, the other part is green. On the green area, there's a superávit of green areas per capita, whereas in the gray area, there's a deficit. So that's what we started working on first, trying to reforest the gray area of the city. And that's what I want to say for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Quick request. We ended up short one of the headsets, so hopefully we can get another one up here. Okay, thank you. Otherwise, for the opening remarks about nature-based solutions, I will say, so I'll take this off to make it clear. I will say that there was an interesting mix of what we consider to be solutions where we actually are living in harmony with the earth in terms of ways that we can ensure that we're preserving spaces that are naturally protective, that were built to be naturally protective, like the wetlands and so forth, ways that we can design our built environment in a way that is biomimicry, that mirrors our nature, the earth and the harmony and the natural kind of ecosystem design. And then there are ways that people use the words nature-based solutions, and then the solutions are actually in some ways designed to continue business as usual in terms of polluting, and then trying to have these other measures to suck up the pollution instead of just stopping the pollution in the first place. And so I think that when we talk about nature-based solutions, that we have to make sure that we are really thinking about ways that are natural and ways that are that really center the principles of environmental justice, that protect communities, that protect the earth from harms. And so that would be the one kind of comment I would say in response to the presentation from before, that it included some rich elements that we absolutely need to engage around in terms of preservation, in terms of living in harmony, and some aspects that are problematic from an environmental justice perspective, including specifically some what we would consider to be false solutions like carbon capture and sequestration, which absolutely hits the list. So that's what I would say in my little 2 minutes. Thank you. Oh, awesome.
Pues muchas gracias por la invitación, un gusto estar en este panel.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I would start by saying, how can we make this discussion in an orderly way? What has been done? What can be improved? We need to talk about different scales in a territory. A city means focusing on the houses and then going up to neighborhoods and then to cities, metropolis, and regions. At each scale, there are things happening, maybe not at the speed that is required. I will focus on the first two, houses and neighborhoods. Mexico has done a lot of changes in houses. We recognize that original peoples knew how to make houses the right way, adapted to the climate, to the weather, and we removed that knowledge to make houses the same for everyone, away from urban centers, not accessible. And then people decided to leave their houses. In Mexico, we have vandalized housing issues because 100 million families decided to leave those houses that were not adapted to their needs. And then we did not recognize self-construction. That means people have built their houses according to their resources. And so Mexico has proposed 8 bioclimatic designs, so people could build their houses considering their own context, local materials, and original knowledge of peoples who knew how to build according to their context. We've done that from a top to bottom approach. We give you the blueprints and they can build their houses. We need a social process so we can all learn together. At the neighborhood level, something's happening. We know that we need to have green infrastructure. We need to do it fast, but we're facing a big challenge. Like a municipality, which is the second most important city of Mexico, every day municipal authorities get from 300 to 400 applications to bring down trees. People don't want trees. They see them as a problem, as a source of garbage, as a source of mosquitoes. They don't want them near them. So what can we do? So if authorities have an idea to have a green corridor with green spaces, that people will feel represented in that project. So we need to change a lot in culture. We think that people want nature-based solutions, but that's not true. When you're about to do those projects, the first to resist the project, it's people. And most of them are some of the higher income neighborhoods. So I think that we need to educate people and tell them what this type of projects are about. Even if there's a climate urgency, if people don't support the projects, we will hardly make a great project for our cities. And I will continue with the other scales next.
Yeah, thanks, Matt Holmes, California, Central Valley of California. I'll agree with all that. We're in an urgent situation. We need to do everything we can to help folks, but we need to help folks that need help the most. I know something about inequality. I live in the greatest wealth-creating agricultural region in all of human history, and we have the most poverty-impacted households in the entire country. And so we can keep track of how much sidewalk we have, because there's such a thing as racist sidewalks. White folks got one set of sidewalks, other folks don't. And that leads directly to heat. I got racist sidewalks where my tree planting program has to cut up mountains of concrete just to get something in the dirt. Rich side of town's got a big, thick green belt. It can plant and maintain a tree. Cities are racist structures. There's no accident, right? When we talk about housing, we talk about people dying from heat island effect. We talk about COVID, people dying from COVID. Black folks died from COVID. Filipino nurses died from COVID. History is what's killing us. None of these technical solutions are that interesting. The difference is, what are you investing in people? And so I am also equally worried when I hear about, super clever engineering solutions to global climate instability. I wish carbon capture and sequestration was a good idea. Nobody's ever done it before. Nobody knows how to do it. And the only place they're going to do it is where there's poor people who are vulnerable, right? The only place where they know about the geological structures that you can store carbon in, and they don't look under Oprah's house. They didn't look under Martha's Vineyard. They know about the Delta. They know about Bakersfield. They know about vulnerable places where they're used to taking advantage of people. And so here's the great thing about COVID, it's awful. Here's the great thing about climate change, it's awful. Ignoring vulnerable communities is no longer an option for rich and wealthy places. I'm walking around a neighborhood full of castles. You don't get to hide anymore. Climate's brought everybody together. And so if anybody wants to survive the narrow passage that we're all about to go through, we need to invest in vulnerable people and vulnerable places. And we need to show up for maybe even some people that don't know they need help. This is not my theory of change. Like, these are all great ideas. I plant trees for a living. I'm here because Jorge Daniel Taliant showed up for my community and gave me technical expertise when it was time to fight my governments, because I have two governments that'll sell me out. And he gave me information that helped me fight them. Equity looks like helping people that may not entirely understand the types of help that they need. You shouldn't have to be a sophisticated community to have rights and be protected. You should just have to be people. So if your kindergarten teacher didn't reach you and teach you that doing the right thing, sharing and being fair is how you should live your life, hopefully your economics professor did, and hopefully your emergency management director did. Vulnerable people are hard to take care of in a tight spot. I'll leave it at that.
I think we're going to turn to the next, or the first segment. As mentioned, we've tried to organize our discussion this morning around 4 themes. The first one being municipal policy and management, to dig down a little more into the details, if you will, with respect to policy alignment, administration, resources. Again, I want to underline the fact that we will be reporting out to council with the emerging themes or consensus or key points from this discussion this morning. And so it would be very helpful to us to get some perspective from you with respect to these elements. I won't read through each of these questions, but you can see them here. Everyone has them projected. And nor will I ask all of the panel members to necessarily opine on each point because we are limited for time. But I would start off with perhaps a question that I could pose right away with respect to the resources question. I know that it was mentioned by Doug, our keynote speaker, that the federal government of Canada recently tabled the National Adaptation Strategy. I heard an estimate yesterday from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities that in ballpark figures, something like $5 billion would be required. I'm not sure on what timescale, perhaps annually, I don't know, with respect to making the changes necessary to adapt or to equip municipal level governments to deal with the emerging climate issues that they face, which begs a question about funding and also about coordination. They also underlined, and we should note, that the cost of inaction has been well demonstrated from the very earliest reports of Lord Stern to date in terms of the effect of neglect at a policy or political level at this juncture will be far more costly in terms of the dollar value that people will experience in terms of recovery from fire, flood, heat, and the basic catastrophe that awaits us in a much hotter environment. So I would ask if any of the panel would comment a little bit about how subnational governments could collaborate, or rather how federal governments could sufficiently support the development of marshaling the appropriate resources and effective collaboration with subnational governments. I know that the situation will be different in each country, so I'm curious about whether anyone has any perspectives to share on what may be working or what should be working in terms of that topic. Doug.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Evan. So in our context in Vancouver and in Canada, and specifically, we get a lot of our federal funding through grants, and you have to apply for the grants, and you might get a grant, you might not get a grant, and then you can go and do your work associated with it. The grants are often time-based because they have to align with election timing, so you have to spend the money really quickly. And so it is very difficult and uneven to do any planning around granting. I really believe we need programs that would focus more on, here is what your obligation at each level of government is, and we will provide you, the federal government will provide you ongoing regular funding, and if you don't meet your obligation, we will remove your funding. It just needs to be a very stable relationship of what you're required to do and how we're going to support, or how the federal government would support cities in meeting those outcomes, whether it's related to adaptation or mitigation or even some of the other needs that we have.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Doug just said, and would simply add that in terms of the funding, it's important, if we're going to work together, we're going to work together across governments, we're going to work with community effectively, that the funding accommodates that work, the time it takes to build relationships and find approaches that make sense for everybody, that incorporate multiple values, that address the needs of vulnerable communities. That takes time, and the funding typically doesn't give you the time to do that, and it doesn't give groups that need capacity the capacity to do that. So that's something that needs to be considered as well in designing funding programs.
Bueno, yo para contestar esta pregunta regresaría un poquito a donde.
In response to this question, I would go back to where I left off. I would place it the other way around. We'd have to see how national governments want to reach their goals without considering local governments. That's just impossible. Local governments need to work hand in hand with the national government. Otherwise, nothing can be achieved. Let me just say that Mexico City was the first Latin American city and one of the first cities in the world to align their climate plan with the Paris agreements. We're also investing like never before. We need to acknowledge that, of course, budgets are never enough. However, the investment that has been made over the last few years has been the largest in the world, not only for reforestation, but to bring back vegetation in over 50% of the land, which in Mexico City is conservation land, or it's a type of land that's under one or another scheme for the protection of natural reserves. Mexico City has won over 30 awards, international awards, among which many of those are based on are from natural-based solutions. So the focus is to take traditional knowledge back up. We have the wetlands of Xochimilco, for example, where we still have indigenous populations where agricultural ancestral practices are being picked back up, because this is a good example of how to do things well with those local solutions. So the key is to actually look at it the other way around. How can we help the country by what cities are doing?
Yeah, sure. I would just add that, take this off. I would just add that there is, in tying the global mandate to local policies, there are a few good examples of places where community-driven efforts resulted in policies that advanced emissions reduction and adaptation, including in Illinois in the United States. There was a policy that was put forward called the Just Transition Away from Coal, which mandated the polluters who had been providing historically polluting environmental justice communities. It mandated them to provide resources for the communities to not only transition from coal, but also to do so while providing local jobs. The Portland Clean Energy Fund was 100% developed by communities for communities. It started with looking at the EJ principles that were developed by environmental justice organizations in 1991 and other such principles, including climate justice principles that were developed by frontline communities globally. And they put together a set of principles for the community, and then developed those principles into an actual policy called the Portland Clean Energy Fund that was, again, a multi-solving approach that not only transitioned from dirty energy to clean energy, but did so in a way that created local jobs, and that was 100% community driven. The Boston Resilience and Racial Equity Plan, again, a community driven plan that centered racial justice in examining climate justice. And I'll just also add, in terms of federal policies, right now where there is a lot of action around the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and so forth. And as an overlay, there is this a mechanism called the Justice 40, which is saying that 40% of these funds need to go to environmental justice communities, to frontline communities, to communities that are quote unquote disadvantaged communities. And so that is definitely a start. Some are saying that given the historical context that Matt referred to, that it should really be Justice 100, where 100% of these resources go to frontline communities, because there's a lot to make up for, but it is a marginal start. So I'll say those are a few kind of tangible examples of these connections. Thank you.
Javier.
Empiezo con el tema de recursos, reconocer un...
Let me just begin discussing the matter of resources. Structurally, in Mexico, we can say that our local authorities have very few funds. They have no financial capabilities, they have no budgets, and mostly about 80%, well, I'm talking about all the other states outside Mexico City, they rely 80% of their on the federal government. Of course, there are other Latin American countries that are on the same level, mostly Central American countries. So we have a general crisis in our public finances. So what we need to finance these policies is looking to the land, which is the main mechanism for funding for municipal governments. We're not doing this in Mexico. We have a potential to reach the Latin American average, to collect 1.5% of our GDP only from property tax. How can we then manage this? Let's say we're able to collect progressively this property tax, but how can we manage it? The second question is quite evident. What are those effective strategies? We know what these are. We need to promote non-vehicle transportation. We need mixed income neighborhoods. We need to be able to go buy and walk to buy, walk to the shops, go to your local shops within our own neighborhoods. We know we can do that, but why aren't we? Because many of those projects show resistance to change sidewalks, to increase mobility. A lot of people find these useless. When you have bike paths, people say that these are a waste of time and money. So it goes back to education and learning throughout our general population so that we understand the climate emergency and we can have this alignment. The alignment includes aligning our territory scales. We've discussed housing and neighborhoods, but how can we align that to have a certain type of progressive housing that you will improve over time, can be in an adequate environment with parks, with cultural centers where you have life outside your own home. So we need to align the neighborhood with housing. And then at the level of planning, of urban planning, we need to align transportation systems with land use so that you're providing a wider density to areas that use public transportation the most. We've known this for 40 or 50 years. We know it works. We know it must be done. But honestly, it's very hard to do. And the most relevant we're seeing in Mexico today is that the cities that are progressing towards those policies and implementing those policies is where society is empowered, where we see groups and citizen collectives that have been around for 30 years. They are also demanding, they're protesting, they're taking to the streets. And if it weren't for this active part of society that is promoting transformation and change, we would hardly see these issues taking place in Mexico City, Guadalajara, or Monterrey, which are the three largest cities. Now, in Monterrey, there are 15 years back, and the reference is Texas. So that means that they're 20 years back, and they're looking now to the south to try to move throughout the country. So in Mexico City, we don't need to refer, or in Mexico as a country, we don't need to refer to the global north. We need to look to Latin America, South America, the Caribbean, where we see similar conditions of our budget and institutional capabilities. And there we see how important it is to create networks of cities, and it makes our job very important as the network of resilient cities, because we learn from other cities who will help us learn from our mistakes and from our successes, and together we can find new, successful, innovative ways towards change so that we can have informed, demanding, active, innovative society that is constantly on the backs of the authorities. Otherwise, transformation will not be possible at the speed that we need.
Matt, where does the money come from? Where does the money come from? We just make it up in the States. I don't know if you noticed. We can pay for all sorts of things so long as it's not vulnerable people in vulnerable places. We got hundreds of billions of dollars to help companies that count their money with T's buried underneath poor places, right? So we'll give money to somebody like Chevron to squirt their stuff underground, but only people that don't have the time to be at the planning commission, right? So what you're talking about inclusion. You're talking about giving people informed choices. Communities don't have time to care about that. I got people fighting for their meal on their plate. You think they care about a bike path? I come to them, I plant trees with them all the time. The only reason they let us plant trees is because I'm hiring formerly incarcerated people that nobody else will hire. And those people that have been down a tight road are coming back and they're investing in their own neighborhood, they're healing themselves and they're healing the land. And so like, it's gotta be so frustrating to have an advanced planning degree and been to places that have like complete streets and know the best way to solve something. But when you show up in a neighborhood and they don't want it, man, don't do it to them. Nothing done to a people without those people can possibly be for those people. So don't go out and earn your PhD and don't get your awards for what you designed if it's not what that neighborhood wanted. You may think you need to solve the urban greening master plan or the active transportation master plan, but the truth is everywhere you go is an artifact of the history of white violence and the white supremacy that it created, right? There's no accident that one side of town's dicey. White folks hurt people there. If you're in a room where power is skewed, it goes back to white violence, okay? I don't know how to I can't play this dumb at all. Power, you don't need to fix anybody's neighborhood that's got power, do you? Anybody with power, their neighborhood's already dialed in, isn't it? So power is the problem. All these technical issues around global climate instability require us to seed power and to have people be involved and lead the design of their solution first. And so, I'm in California, we got a ton of coin, and nobody bats an eye at giving it to an engineering solution, a technical solution, companies that already got a ton of cash. But you tell them, can I hire some people? Can I hire some people to plant some trees so they can afford to eat, so they can buy an $18 sandwich in California, so they don't have to drive 72 miles to the Bay Area so they can flip somebody else's hotel bed or make them a burrito? What's resilient? Driving somewhere else to be a second-class citizen in a first-class world because you don't get to live there? How about they stay in my neighborhood and they plant trees along the Delta and they protect 25% of California's water, 25% of California's food distribution? We just came out of a 5-year drought, and I'll tie this back to the history of white violence and white supremacy. 5-year drought, and we go to our senior water rights holders. These are people that got their rights before 1914. We said, dude, we're in a drought. You guys are still putting in grapevines. They're plowing over all the pasture, putting in irrigated grapevines, irrigated pistachios, irrigated almonds. We only grow almonds to make Chinese ranchers poor. We only grow pistachios to make Iranian ranchers poor. We're growing rice to keep Southeast Asian poor. Nobody eats that stuff in California. Federal Farm Bill and illegally cheap water in California and labor abuse is why we have all those things in California. You know why they have those water rights? You know why they have those water rights? Because they took that land before 1914. You took a Homestead Act where you had to be white to even apply. You want to buy a house? We've handed out money before in the states, like the Inflation Reduction Act. We had the Federal Housing Act, Fair Housing Act. We handed money over to local municipalities, local regions, local real estate agents, the real working edge of white violence and white supremacy after we moved it into policy. Good ideas in the central government get beat up in the hinterlands. We use them for terrible things. So whether it was the Housing Act, whether it was a Transportation Act where we used freeways to knock down all the neighborhoods of color just to get them out of downtown. Like in Stockton, we cut off our nose to spite our face. Largest Filipino population outside of the Philippines. First organized farm workers from Hawaii to Alaska to Stockton. We knocked down all their buildings because we got to get a freeway in to fight the Russians and get to the port. We finished the freeway 30 years later. So if I give anybody some advice, go back, sniff around your history, find out the white violence that designed your city, and be honest about it. It's not your fault. You're too young for that. The only thing that's your fault is playing dumb about it after you find out.
How are we doing for, okay, so perhaps we could move to the second topic there. I should ask, we have one question. Do we have a question? Okay, I'm sorry, I was remiss in not indicating that we'll also have space and time for questions from our online audience as well as in here. So please.
Yes. So how can we overcome political inertia in implementing the policies and commitments that we already have? That is the issue for local governments.
Okay, political inertia.
Yeah, how to, I guess a citizen wants to know how to overcome political inertia in projects.
La intervención que estaba haciendo.
Okay. So this has to do with what I was saying, bringing these nature-based solutions to people and for people to own them. In Mexico City, we have important efforts, rainwater growers, projects where we do not get rain. We have pollinator gardens. But if people do not participate, if they don't get involved, they'll fail. We as government, we go and train, but if people don't own the projects, we don't get anywhere. And people criticize, well, Mexico City doesn't have a very nice grass. There's only bad weeds. And no, that's not the right focus. For pollinators to come back, we need to do it the other way around. And we have a motto. the worse the hair looks, the better. So if there's grass, we need to have weeds or plants and flowers that are attractive or pollinators. And we're doing some work with people, and in wetlands, we have awards from UNESCO, FAO, and traditional practices. And we're making people own this so that they don't stay as government programs. That's the only way that in the long term, this commitment and for turning the development paradigm will become owned by people, regardless of the government. So people will demand green areas, not only parks. We have the largest urban park and the best urban park of the world, Chapultepec Forest. But apart from Chapultepec, we have some areas that are getting restored. And just very quickly, I'd like to end with this. As Daniel said in his opening remarks, he said that everything has changed to a gray infrastructure. If you've been to Mexico City, you know that many streets are called River, Rio Churubusco, Rio Magdalena, the main avenues, because they used to be rivers and they run underneath. That idea during the 60s and 70s that they had to put the rivers in a pipe. No, we're trying to revert that trend. But if we don't have people with us, we will not get anywhere as a government. That's why we need to create those communities, and people are responding to our government initiatives.
Let me rephrase the question, perhaps. Perhaps instead of political inertia, picking up on Jacqueline's point, what can people suggest is the role for environmental justice as a driver to engage or to generate genuine support for the policies, the administration, the tactics at a municipal level that really must happen, that we've all acknowledged are necessary? How do you begin from a place of justice that will inform the politics that will then, hopefully infect our governments?
So I think about one example in Chicago, which is my hometown, where the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, another group like Pero and others, they were being polluted on by a coal-fired power plant. And what they did was they first started a public campaign, really started to do protests in front of City Hall. They had a strategic media campaign, a digital campaign, and they really did that to touch the hearts of people, to see what was actually happening. They did a replica of like smokestacks, and they used data from the Harvard School of Public Health about the number of asthma hospitalizations, the number of deaths that were resulting from these coal-fired power plants. They went from there to then developing a set of again, principles for what the community wants. The community wants clean air. So they didn't necessarily kind of directly attack the companies per se, or kind of to take it from a political route. They established, what do we all want for ourselves? We want clean air to breathe. We want clean water to drink. We want these things, like really just things that everybody wants. And then they wrote a resolution that kind of said, well, here are the standards that we need to have in terms of clean air. And then they developed a local ordinance. And then they started to really have these relationships with the city council, with the office of the mayor to advance this ordinance. And they were successful in passing this ordinance that then, where the mayor mandated to the company that owned these coal-fired power plants that you either need to clean them up or shut them down. And within 6 months, they were shut down. And so that was a way that they really engaged the public, that they brought it from a heart-centered perspective, changing hearts and then changing minds. And then they practically came up with the actual policy and put it in the hands of the city council to pass. So that's an example that I would put forward.
Doug, you're a city manager. Perhaps a perspective from inside in terms of what works. How do you engage or mobilize the political support that's necessary for this sort of long-term work that we've talked about?
Yeah, so cities, regardless how well educated city staff are in environmental justice, on working really closely with communities and knowing sort of what some of the technical solutions are, because you're right that the solutions are straightforward. It's getting the voices to council, because all city staff report to the council, to the politicians at the end of the day, who have 1,000 voices in their ears telling them what they should be doing. And those voices are people who are organized, who have time to lobby, who have resources to lobby. And most of the people who need to get their voices elevated don't have that opportunity. So what city staff need to do, and we're trying to do it in Vancouver, is elevate those voices. And we do it through multiple ways. We are going to the leaders in the community, and instead of me showing up at a community meeting and saying, hey, we're going to put a bike route in your neighborhood and plant some trees, we actually get those community leaders to be our voices and to be our support and to bring back the messages to us. We pay people to come and engage with us. We want people to actually spend time with us. They need to pay for daycare, they need to pay for transit, whatever it takes to work with us. We will go to their neighborhoods and ask them what they need, as opposed to saying, come to City Hall, at 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon. That doesn't work for people. We need to go to where they are, meet with them where they're at. And so by doing that, it allows staff to bring those voices in front of council, either in person or just through the dialogue that we've had, so council can hear them and ideally make the right decisions, and then direct me as a staff person to go and respond to those things.
We have time for one brief question. Yeah. Please.
Bueno, buenas tardes, buenos días, perdón. ¿Qué razón
Hi,
tiene Matt?
everyone. You're so right, Matt, when you're talking about violence. Not only white violence, there's also black violence. And the problem is the lack of education in our society. I'd like to challenge you. At least in Mexico, we have 2,400 municipalities, approximately. And how many of those have a long-term project? I cannot count them with my hand. The issue is that we are not able to have long-term projects. Because of politics in our country, we've settled with quarterly or 6-year plans. We need to think of society plans. And we need to help them get organized. So if we don't do that, if we do not take development in our hands, no one will do it for us. And I think this is part of what the CEC can do through the JPEG to recommend governments nationally and subnationally to foster the public policies so that in communities we carry out local development plans. In my community, we were able to do a 20-year plan up to 2029. And we believe we need to work now towards 2050. That was my comment. Thank you. Now trying to link the last two questions, certainly there's an issue of urgency. And of course, we need to act. We need to have a force. That force is making us go towards a direction, the model of accumulation of richness. We still do not know how to stop that. So before that force, we have 3 alternatives. One, to continue to where that force will lead us and to try to decide as species how we want to say goodbye to this planet. Because clearly, if we continue in that direction, that's going to happen. So how do we want to say goodbye? With a zombie apocalypse, or by recognizing that we're all humans and saying, okay, we didn't do it right? But maybe we will spend the last minutes of our existence in another way. Then we can also take control. We see in Mexico City, Claudia Sheinbaum, she has been fighting from the left wing. Now she is the mayor and she's doing changes, maybe in the right direction, maybe not at the right pace. And the other inertia, or the other thing is, how do we stop that system? How do we make that inertia not lead us to where we don't want to? So I think we need to start thinking of other concepts that will articulate our society and our institutions. So far, the only concept that does that is power, because we believe that power makes us evil, makes us corrupt, and that we have that flaw as a species. And I don't think that's right. We have the power of caring. Caring needs to become the centermost concept of our society and our institutions. And what can help us have more strength in that? The feminist movement. Until that happens, we will not be able to change that inertia. Even if we have plans, short and long term, they will not be enough to go against that force that is taking us to disappear as a species.
I think we'll have an opportunity to continue this as we progress through some of the other themes, but let's move to our second topic here, which is with respect to some of the nature-based solutions, some of which were articulated in our opening presentation. It would be interesting to hear from you with respect to your experience locally as to policies in action. Which solutions have you seen that work, that should be advanced, that should be promoted on a continental basis? In terms of mitigation, adaptation, we've had a little bit of discussion about, clearly and heard you with respect to concerns about some solutions that may be a distraction, but there are solutions. They're evident, they're about us, but I'd like to hear from you with respect to ones that you think are necessary to promote to a continental level to encourage the widespread adaptation. And in general, nature-based solutions, including reinforcing this sense of our relationship with nature, or encouraging a different understanding of our place in the ecosystem at an urban scale. How do we get to that point? So I don't know if anybody wants to start off in response to this, but Doug did outline some points. I think maybe Matt will just get you to kick us off then.
Just like to say, does anybody need an AI learning, machine learning model to know that it's a good idea to plant a tree? Does everybody know when the best time to plant a tree was? 30 years ago. What's the next best time? Right now, right? And so trees in California are very smart people, think that trees are net emitters because they look at a tree, you grow a tree, it breaks down and it releases methane, and it doesn't address climate change. But it did give someone a job who had enough money to drive away during a wildfire. It did provide shade for a house and keep its air conditioner from turning on. It did cool down a street where drivers drove slower and hit less people. It did make kids feel better about their neighborhood. You know how hard it is to hold up dignity when everybody makes you live in a dumpy spot? Come to the wrong side of town. I got 1942 sidewalks in South Stockton. I got 88,000 people living on $32,000 a year. South of a freeway that just dumps pollution on them that nobody asked for and nobody needs. We died 13 years earlier in our census tracts in that part of Stockton. You guys want me to help you with polar bears? I would trade every polar bear on this planet for one of my kids from the neighborhood. And if you don't realize that people matter, that every 36 ounces of brain tissue matters, then you're never going to solve this problem, because the problem, we got brilliant people that can solve all these problems. So long as you have disposable people and disposable places, the fascists will use that to make people easy to kill. Sorry, we're talking about politics, and the old political paradigm needs to die. That's right, you're absolutely right. Feminismo, we need to change who has power. You shouldn't even be talking to me. I shouldn't even be up here. You know how many beautiful, brilliant young women of color I work with? I don't let them come to things like this, because things like this are white cultural institutions and people treat them wrong. Like, I don't let anybody show up for a government thing. I protect them. I keep them away. Let them have their ideas somewhere else. Only came to this place because Jorge Daniel Taliant showed up for us and we didn't even know who he was. I'm sure you're all nice people, but this is not my theory of change. But he's talking about change. The old power, sorry, old power needs to die.
Deborah, perhaps I could ask you, with your experience in British Columbia, you know, how are the communities that you work with managing with respect to some of the solutions that are, you know, necessary?
Well, I guess I should say first off that just even this term nature-based solutions, it doesn't, I feel like it's not, it's become the currency, but I feel like it doesn't describe really the good work that's being done or needs to be done. And I think something about, you know, recognizing where we are, the places where we live, what is there? What do we work with? Who are the people we work with? But what is the place? What is the nature that we are part of? And that leads to thinking about it a different way. It's not like there is a technical fix that is in the form of a nature-based solution that you're just going to drop into a place. You need to know the place where you are. And so you need to spend time with the community, thinking about what the community needs are, but also what is there? What does nature need? One example that we've been working on is it's essentially a salt marsh restoration project, but I think you could also call it a reconciliation project. And it's called the Living Dike, but the idea is that there's this bay in Metro Vancouver called Boundary Bay, because it's part of it is in the United States, but it has the largest salt marsh in southern British Columbia. But it has, that's saying that it's just the marsh, but really it's connected to all parts of the ecosystem, right? But the salt marsh is very, very valuable from a biodiversity perspective, and also very valuable to the folks that live there, including Semiahmoo First Nation. It's the heart of their traditional territory. So the issue is that that area is surrounded by settlement, farms, and homes, and it's protected by 14 kilometers of diking. So with sea level rise, the initial idea was, oh, we have to raise the dikes because the water's gonna be higher. It's inevitable, it's gonna go up slowly, but inevitably. But the problem with that is that would be the end of the salt marsh and everything that's connected to it, because it would be permanently underwater. It couldn't move landwards. So the idea came to see if it was possible, instead of focusing attention on raising the dikes, to tilt up slightly, ever so slightly, the salt marsh and support it to grow so that it would be able to persist through time. And to do this, though, this has required a lot of people working together and thinking about how to do this in a good way, and how to find connections with other work, how to find funding from various sources. And there's been a core partnership of the City of Surrey, Semiahmoo First Nation, and City of Delta, and I can say they've never worked together that way before. Even City of Surrey and City of Delta, they're adjacent, they haven't worked together. But there has been so much learning. There have been about 20 meetings in the past year and a half just to figure out the relationships and the project and what it needs, and how it can connect to other work that's going on, and how it can be a basis for some long-term cooperation in the area. So it's possible to do this work, but we can't just think about it as a project, as a type of solution. It has to make sense for the place where it's being developed.
Example of the best time to plant a tree, maybe 30 years ago, the next best to be today. The same could be said with respect to our housing stock. Green building is a topic that's been around for a while. CEC did some pioneering work on the challenges and opportunities in North America about 10, 12 years ago, the point was made by our experts at the time was that every house that is not built today to the highest standards of net zero is a lost opportunity. And of course, we're not going to go and change all of the housing stock that we have overnight in terms of cost and other issues, but there are examples at the municipal level and federally. I'm wondering if people could talk a little bit about housing and the nature of our built environment at the local level in terms of its impact or the opportunities for solutions, particularly in the context of the heat crisis that we've been talking about.
Una de las cosas es, en la Ciudad de México es que
Right. So in Mexico City, we have such rich cultural diversity and biocultural diversity that it's a paradox. It might be a reflection of what's happening globally, and where we have the poorest communities, we have the richest culture diversity. So what we need to do is kind of reverse that process. So what do we do that? By taking these local examples to a much larger, even global scale. Mexico City is a signatory of the Edinburgh Declaration. It is a network of cities who participate to bring to fruition the 2020 Biodiversity Plan. Mexico City is a pioneer in that area together with a network of cities. So along with that, we have nature photography contests, and there are areas where you wouldn't believe it's Mexico City because you can't see a single building. It's in the natural area of the city where with trap photography, we've seen the return of coyotes and other predators. And if there are predators, that means that the supply chain is coming back and the food chain is coming back. And we hadn't seen that for years. That's due to the nature-based solutions that have made it able for us to understand the complexity between urban and natural areas in the city itself. And we've been able to bridge that. The city is now full of parks. We have a very ambitious plan called Planting Parks, Sembrando Parques, that reduces the gray area that I mentioned. That's reduced crime indexes, it's improved the quality of air, whereas before in the 80s, Mexico City was one of the worst cities in the world for air quality, and now we have most of the year quite good quality of air. Of course, this isn't the eighth wonder, but as opposed to what it was like before, it's huge progress. And that's been achieved because we have a lot more trees, a lot more urban orchards, areas with flowers and plants for pollination. And we're seeing a return to traditional knowledge as well, not just in Mexico City, but for all of Mexico, our food base is maize. And in Mexico City, we also have a lot of food that is locally produced, distributed locally, consumed locally. And through all this, we are going back to that millenary traditional knowledge. You may not know this, but Mexico City used to be a lake. And when the Europeans arrived in Mexico City, the first thing they did was dry out the lake. So we are in a settlement that used to be a lake, so the issue of water is a huge challenge. How can we go back to that? Well, we can't retrieve the lake because we have urban development, but we can recover it partly. And we have been recognized by UNESCO and the FAO, where we have the wetlands of Xochimilco, Tláhuac, and Milpalta, which are great examples of social participation and the involvement of the community. Let me say as well that we have an amazing program called Rain Collection, Cosecha de Lluvia, which brings rain collectors to the poorest areas of the city. So we're having these rain collectors installed, and they are helping mainly women, because women used to have to go fill buckets of water. How many buckets of water can you carry? 2 at the most. And they'd have to walk miles upwards because of course we have very uneven topography, and they had to walk uphill to carry 2 buckets of water back home. That has changed now, and that situation has changed for women mainly, who now have access to water for main cleaning and household chores, even cooking, and that has changed over 4 or 5 years. These are very simple solutions that had not been implemented before. And all this, of course, points to a matter of not only social equity, but to closing gaps between the poorest and the richest areas of the city. And also it has to do with gender equality. It is becoming evident through this, and this is my closing point, why I'm convinced that Mexico needs a woman president. Because we are one of the very few countries that has not had a woman in charge in Latin America, out of the largest Latin American countries. And it's time for that.
Might I ask, though, to come back to the point I was making about housing. I think it's a good example in the sense that we have national building codes, at least in Canada, we have national building codes and standards that are predicated upon some understanding of both the engineering, but also the what's necessary in terms of heating, cooling, and so forth. And then this is translated down into provincial standards, and then ultimately, however, and most importantly, municipal or local building codes and so on. So the real action, the critical area of engagement with builders, with homeowners, and so on, is your local government, and they set the pace here. So perhaps Doug, you might be able to elaborate a little bit from your perspective. I mean, how can we use that as an example in terms of there being national standards, international standards for that matter, and getting that down to a level of where it's you know, on the ground, literally, in terms of people building to the standard that's expected or required in terms of meeting some of the objectives that we've been talking about?
Sure, absolutely. So one of the really big challenges is you're absolutely correct in saying we have national, provincial standards, and there's state standards in the US. However, very few cities have control over the actual building code. We enforce the code. We require it to be done to a certain level, and we provide the permitting, but we don't actually often get to say what they have to build to. So Vancouver is one of the few cities that we actually have our own charter, where we have full control over our building codes. We have to meet all of the other provincial and federal standards, but we can add significant additional, which is one of the reasons that pretty well every new building in Vancouver is being built to zero emissions right now. New buildings. Existing buildings, however, are a huge challenge. Before I go to existing buildings, new buildings, it's very frustrating. Like Vancouver does have that extra power of the charter so we can do it, but there's really nothing stopping any jurisdiction, provincial, federal, from going to zero emission buildings right now. And in Vancouver's context or BC's context, it means electrifying. It is very inexpensive. It's essentially heat pumps and some better insulation. And we're now finding in British Columbia, it's less expensive to build a zero emission building than it is a natural gas-based building. And of course, operating that building is much less expensive, and the air quality inside the building is much better. So that's new buildings. Existing buildings are a much, much bigger challenge. And it really is a big equity piece on existing buildings. So I'll give you an example in the automotive industry. When airbags and anti-lock brakes first came out, they came out in Mercedes and BMWs and the fancy cars because they were new technology, the supply chains didn't exist. And that's where the money was in order to get those things happening. Now those are ubiquitous and they're in every single vehicle, as they should be. So if you're lower income and you need to buy a car, it will have airbags and anti-lock brakes and make your life safer. The same thing is sort of happening with existing buildings. We need to retrofit buildings with better windows, with better heat pumps, period. We need to remove hot water tanks and put in either heat pumps or electric hot water tanks. We need to put in better insulation. But if cities were to just force people to do that right now and say, everybody must do this, the people who are rich can probably do it. And the big corporations who have big apartment buildings and big commercial properties can do it. But the low income people, the renters, the people in single family homes, they wouldn't be able to afford to do it. So we need to start by giving money, which is as painful as it is, we need to give money to the richer single family homeowners, give money to the big corporations to start those retrofits in order to get the supply chains going, get the technology going, get the trades all trained up to be able to put those installations in. And now that we've been doing that for a few years, we can start pulling back those incentives and giving those incentives to the lower income groups, the rental apartments, and start requiring people who can afford to pay for it to actually do the retrofits and use that money to help fund the lower income people who can't necessarily afford to do it.
Jacqueline, I'd be interested in your perspective. You know, we here in Canada and elsewhere have noticed the enormous amount of money that's being dedicated to climate action in the United States. Very, you know, welcome investments. And there's a panoply of incentives, rebates, grants, and so forth through the retrofitting of homes and existing buildings. But is it enough? I mean, I think I know the answer to that, but is it working? Do we have the right mix of incentives that will engage not only the people who need it the most in the communities that need it the most, but also the workers, the people who would be engaged in this process of rebuilding our cities to the standards that we know we must accomplish?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, out of concern for that very question, in 2018, we launched the Centering Equity in the Sustainable Building Sector initiative because we really saw, our building at the NAACP in Baltimore, Maryland, was, I mean, every few days, or not every few days, every few weeks or so, we would get a call that everybody needs to go home immediately because something would been found in the building. The building was having all of these challenges. And so an appraiser came by and said that it would be more economically advantageous to just raise the building and start all over again than it would be to continue to try to fix it and retrofit it, you know, at radon and lead and all these different things that would be discovered in the building, not to mention its energy inefficiency and otherwise. And so from that, I started to attend meetings around and meet with people around this issue of having a building that would be LEED Platinum certified, that would fill all the petals of the International Living Futures Institute building standards and so forth. And I found in meeting after meeting, whether it was events or bilateral meetings, that it was a very homogenous field, and that all the examples that I could find of buildings that met these standards were buildings that were, you know, either universities or corporation, like large corporation-owned buildings, and that the communities that were in the buildings that were least disaster resilient, that were most likely to be sick buildings, that were least energy efficient, like none of those buildings had any of these standards fulfilled. And then I started to look at the policy landscape. What are the policies that were both at the federal level, at the state level, and the local level, including building codes, and just started to see again the dearth of policies that were really community centered, that were really looking at multi-solving for communities. And so we developed this initiative to have an approach that pulled in people, that of course was led by local communities, but pulled in universities, pulled in building folks, pulled in workforce development folks and so forth, to make sure again that we have a multi-solving approach around this. It continues to be a journey because there's just so far to go to reach the place where we need to be around this, but it is a conversation where we're finding these equity challenges, like in Portland, when they were actually trying to do what we need is these building codes. The Portland NAACP actually stood up and said, well, no, because this is actually going to disproportionately disadvantage certain communities, because if there's, and certain owners of buildings who are, who are owners of small businesses, because they'll be labeled as unsafe buildings because of earthquakes and so forth, but yet they're not giving the resources that are needed to bring the buildings up to code. So that's an example of the many things that we're finding, and the importance of having community-led folks in this conversation. And so and I'll just end by saying that even this notion of having community-driven engagement was really, for us, we had to involve culture workers, narrative strategy folks, to really think about like how communities see this as their issue, because otherwise it kind of sounds wonky. And among all the things that we're dealing with, how is it actually going to help me? But when we tie it to the illnesses that we're having in our communities because of indoor air pollution, when we tie it to COVID and the fact that we all had to be indoors for such a long time and that we were differentially vulnerable to COVID, then people start to see it more as their issue, because these are places where we spend the vast majority of our days, places where we live, work, play and pray. So I'll just stop there. But in this initiative, the whole purpose was to make sure that communities saw this as their issue, that communities were put in the place of making decisions. And so even with this initiative, we ended up with a community-led conversation with the Government Services Administration, which deals with the federal buildings, and putting forth a community-led set of standards for even our federal buildings. So I invite people to visit the website of the Center on Equity in the Sustainable Building Sector to read more about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions from our floor? Okay, good. Shall we move to the next topic, sir? So there are two remaining sections here, but I just want to build upon the beginning remarks of Danielle with respect to the importance of environmental justice and community engagement. You know, we've talked a lot about how it's necessary to imbue all of this from that perspective and to hopefully advise our federal ministries and entities about the importance of this. But I guess I would ask perhaps Doug comment a little bit about this in terms of his experience as a municipal manager, about how municipalities can ensure that we prioritize environmental justice or the perspective of the communities. You talked, I think, quite effectively about how it was important that you go out and actually engage with communities, make it as easy as possible to flip some of the power relationships that have previously bedeviled engagement at the municipal level. And I'm wondering if perhaps others might have any observations about techniques or approaches that have been particularly effective in terms of engaging marginalized communities around specific municipal action or issues that need to be addressed at an urban level. Yeah, please.
Pieces that I mentioned earlier, the City of Vancouver recently developed a climate justice charter. So we invited a number of equity-seeking groups to sit down with us, and over about a year, we had multiple discussions and conversations about what that would look like. And through that process, we realized, like historically, what cities do is they sit down and talk to people, and then we take their input and then write it in our own words, and then put it in our own council reports, and then bring it up to council. And sometimes things get lost in translation. One of the principles that we understood was that power differential. So when we wrote this climate justice charter, we realized fairly early in the conversation that we as city staff can't write it. We need to provide the space and hold the space for the community to speak and to put it together. We brought in an external consultant to act as a scribe for the community and to put down the community's words, but the city did not edit it. We did not direct it. We asked for clarification and we supported it as best we could, but it was written by the community. And there was some challenging language in there that we're like, this is part of the conversation, part of the negotiation we have to do here is by giving up some power. We need to give up a lot more power, but this was a step in that direction where this official city document was written by an external group that we brought to council, and then council endorsed that for the City of Vancouver. So that's just one example of a way to bring those voices and give up some of the power we traditionally have.
Matt, I'd be interested in your experience in California about approaching civic government, engaging civic government. How does it work for you?
You know, I mean, to say that it works would be disingenuous, right? Our cities are beat down. Like, we abandoned our cities. We stopped paying for staff to take care of stuff. Folks that owned houses 50 years ago, they used to have a maintenance guy that knew every tree in the neighborhood. His job was to tend to that tree. We laid that guy off, right? And we refused to rehire him. So we haven't replaced trees on the whole south side of town that was exclusively people of color because we have Jim Crow cities. You guys know about Jim Crow. One set of rules for whites, one set of rules for everybody else that isn't white. So our towns in the United States are entirely segregated, and they still are. So you get two sets of rules at the municipal level. And you talked about earlier, Doug, folks that have time to complain and be squeaky and put their city to work, those aren't folks that got 3 jobs. Our city found $10 million and they're like, well, we're going to address trees and we're going to address it by complaint, which is the least equitable way to address it. You got a satellite, I'll tell you where to plant a tree. We'll plant it where it's hottest, right? And we'll address heat island effect. Or we'll talk to a neighborhood about like their most valuable corridor that they walk to school on. You know, there are all sorts of, those are ways where a city can seed part of the planning process. It's hard to give up power. You kind of touched on this earlier. Nobody knows if they're a good person until they have power. And a lot of leaders are failing when they get power. It's easier just to silence people and move on. In cities, you know, they're subjects to larger power structures. When you're talking about housing, why would I care about if my house is sustainable, if it's poisonous, and I have to come home to a lead radon filled house? I might care if I own it, right? And ownership strategies, that's how you protect yourself. You own the things that matter to you. You don't ask your government to protect you. People with money don't need that. People with money don't ask the government to come protect them because they have power and they have money. So when we talk about home ownership in the States, we're always running out low-income housing, affordable housing. You know how we make wealth in the States? You own your house and you sell it for some crazy inflated price, and you better get your own kids and your neighbor's kids, and you take a piece out of them to become a millionaire because you sold some World War II bungalow. You have to help people own their own communities. You know who's in the way of that? Like cities can stand up to banks. Cities can create banks. Cities can actually give a loan to a nurse or a teacher for 600 grand when Wells Fargo would only qualify them for 300, right? And you can pick good neighbor programs, and you can sell a home to somebody who you want in your community, that you've recognized that there's a shortage of, or a neighborhood that you've left behind for a long time, and you increase home ownership. And it's a revolving loan fund. They've done this in Richmond, California with the Richmond Community Foundation, and they used workforce development programs to buy those houses, flip those houses, give everybody experience, and then you sell that house to somebody from that neighborhood. And then they own the neighborhood. And then the city might listen to them.
Please.
Del tema 3, hay un caso.
Regarding the third topic, there is one case that has been very successful. It's been studied. It's the case of Iztapalapa, one of the 16 regions in the city, about 2 million inhabitants. It was done or developed informally, so to speak. So it was a region created with informal mechanisms to build the houses. They had the highest violence indexes in Mexico, above the national average. A lot of gender violence. And after a lot of work with local organizations and a mayor, a female mayor coming from the popular movements since the 80s, there was a big transformation. And this was done through utopies. These are public spaces that were retrieved, abandoned spaces. And now we have sports facilities, community support for women, legal advice for women to fight against the feminicides. And so people and the society will feel protected with green spaces and do sports. That reconstruction of the social tissue at Iztapalapa is making a great change. Before, no one wanted to come. And now there are international groups coming to Mexico City and that go to Iztapalapa to observe that transformation, and that transformation of public spaces with the city vision, where we have new transportation systems, a system that is a cable like the ones we had in Medellin, innovation coming from Latin American countries. And so this is becoming a new reference, how to address displacement of people who are living in places where before they used to walk for an hour and a half only to get to the nearest metro station to be able to connect to the transportation network. Now it's only 20 minutes. And so that is a reconception of the city with new community mechanisms. Now, on the house roofs, there's a lot of urban art. And so the cities were reconstructed. Violence has gone down. People are owning the spaces. You have activities from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. You can see families out on the streets doing sports, getting legal advice for women. And so there's a new community space that is transforming the city. I think that's environmental justice, to find what are the most vulnerable areas and to concentrate your work there, because that's where it's required the most. And what a better way than doing it with public funds. That is the case I want to talk about. It's gotten international attention, thanks to that community work that has been happening for over 30 years in the heart of the Iztapalapa neighborhood.
Go ahead. Their specific community. That was fantastic. Is there anybody else who would like to talk on the engagement related to climate justice?
Mario.
Yeah.
Solamente enfatizar que, en efecto,
just to emphasize that as long as there's not a community engagement, the government will not succeed. They need to convince people about the benefits of owning the efforts and engaging sectors that had not been considered before. Now there is a network. For example, there's a network of women who are creating urban orchard. And now women are creating these orchards. They've learned and they are sharing the knowledge to other women. The program has been so successful that now men want to learn and participate. So they are creating a network of orchards and what we call gardens for life for pollinators. And we also see how to own a small space and you plant a tree, and we're trying to bring back pollinators to one of the largest cities of the world. And that has been thanks to owning this and not letting knowledge in a single space, but making it public, and people become stewards of the knowledge, and that is essential.
Deborah, I'm wondering if, from your perspective, in terms of the communities that you've been working with, whether you have anything that you'd like to share with us in terms of tactics or approaches that have been successful in terms of getting the attention or motivating local governments to do their part.
I know there's not much time left, so I was wondering if I could actually make a slightly different contribution, which is we haven't talked much about about the role of education in this, and particularly for young people. But it is on my mind, and I know there were a few youth here, but generally they seem to be not too much part of these conversations, especially when it comes to policy. But I think we should change that. But part of it is just kind of the very basic level of education that we're delivering in our schools about people knowing where they are. And I know people, especially settler people, we wander around everywhere, so there's no guarantee we'll be in one place at any given time. But generally, I think if you learn the tools to understand where you are, it'll help you participate in these discussions. You'll kind of know like what's at stake in your neighborhood. So one thing would be from the natural perspective, learning what watershed you're in. As you said, and it's a reality here as well, many of our creeks and streams have been put into pipes, so it's not even obvious anymore where the water is, where it's coming from. A second thing, and I heard about this yesterday in the environmental justice discussion about the idea of toxic tours. I think that would be very effective, particularly for high school kids. I mean, it's something that would have to be done with a lot of sensitivity, but I think that's a great idea to really understand like what the problems are as well that we're facing, the challenges. So that's one thing I wanted to add to this discussion.
Yes. Of course, the education agenda and doing those toxic tours with young people, but also with leadership present. You know, doing it with kids and telling them, oh, you got a big problem, this is what you have to deal with, and not connecting them to power to do something about it can be pretty disempowering. But as far as like tactics to get people involved and to care, pay them. There's nothing grosser than you planners sitting on one side of the table and everybody else is there as a volunteer, and you're pumping them for ideas, and then you're going to sign off and call it yours. Pay them. We paid 57 people $28 an hour to design their own park. We took a Rails to Trails project. It was 12 acres of inner city park. It's just like you're talking about. We made them own it, right? We paid them to design it, and then we paid them to build everything they could, everything below basically a tractor that they can handle. So we had a $6 million park grant, which was a terrible competitive state grant that we had to fight some other city over. California likes to drop one sharp stick in between two poor communities, and the first one that picks it up and takes the other community out first wins. But we gave over $1 million out of $6 million to residents, hyperlocal residents, folks that lived within a few blocks. That park doesn't really have vandalism problems. It doesn't have all the maintenance problems that some of the other parks have, because the people that built it, that are living there, that are looking out their front door, that's their park, and they own it entirely. And it's not weird to pay people. Find a community-based organization and pay through them. We've all seen the contracts that cities hand out to terrible people who don't do their job. Take a risk on your residents. Pay them too to care about your problems. Then they'll have time to show up.
Yep. Any questions? Nope. Okay. All right. So let's just roll on right through. As I mentioned at the outset, one of the things that's unique about this organization is the opportunity to speak directly to our federal governments. Later this afternoon, I'll be speaking with the Council of Ministers and their representatives, and doing my best to reflect some of the wisdom, some of the thoughts, some of the key points that have been raised in our discussion this morning. So with that in mind, I'd like you to sort of maybe shift your perspective somewhat from the local to the continental. You know, it's part of the business of the CEC to encourage the parties, as we call them, to think continentally, to recognize that we have 3 countries but 1 environment, and that we need to encourage our federal governments to consider the opportunity to collaborate, not only on a government-to-government basis, but on a continental basis. And this has been shown to be necessary in everything from obviously the larger pollution issues that are respect no boundaries, to issues like transportation, long-haul trucking, the electrification, energy policy, and so forth. But from the perspective of the topic that we've been discussing today in terms of community solutions and the urban environment, I'd ask each of you to consider for a moment, or to ask if you have suggestions that we might make to them with respect to the opportunities for a North American agenda, or for an agenda that would at least take the continental perspective and bring that down, or bring up the perspective of local communities to a continental perspective. What are the opportunities for collaboration, the benefits, and some of the mechanisms or supports that may be necessary to make that happen? I'd like each of you to be able to speak to that in general. That would be of great assistance to us in communicating with our parties. Mario, perhaps we'll start with you.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Yes, of course. Mexico City is already working formally with the state of California, with CalPA and the Californian Commission, and we have signed collaboration agreements. Also with Montreal. We had the mayor of Montreal in Mexico City. She was fascinated with the cable bus, which you mentioned. If you go to Mexico City, you need to experience that. It really shows you this cultural richness of Mexico City and how such a relatively simple effort was able to improve the lives of hundreds of people. And what I would tell the members of the council very respectfully is that there is a collaboration between the cities of the three countries, and that we have an opportunity to strengthen the networks. We collaborate in different networks, but we also collaborate without having those networks, because we have found the best practices, we know our mistakes, and we know how to support national efforts. So just to remind national governments that local governments are fundamental for their objectives. If Mexico City does not comply with our goals, Mexico as a country will not comply or will not achieve them. That is the importance of local governments. We are in a fundamental moment. The world will see us as a region. In the World Soccer Cup, the three countries will be hosts. This is a great opportunity to tell the world
con más posibilidades.
That we have a lot of possibilities as a region. We have a region with endemic species like the monarch butterfly.
Ballenas que recorren las costas de nuestros 3 países.
We share them, and also the whales. The connection we have between the three economies. And that brings us challenges, but also great opportunities. And if cities are not part of that process, we will not get anywhere. So we should remind them that we need to have all of these exercises in a frequent way.
What would you ask him to consider to keep it foremost in mind with respect to the opportunities to advance these issues on a North American scale?
So I think that I'll say first that there's only so much that EPA can do within kind of this broader context of when we talk about cooperation between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. I will start by the fact that it struck me once again as I was coming over here and getting on the ferry in Port Angeles, how easy it was for me to come over here. And I juxtaposed that against the images of people coming across the Mexican border and being greeted with people on horseback with using their reins, their reins as kind of to hoard people and to herd people, and people in cages. And so it strikes me in terms of the extent to which we actually are having a equality, or if we're actually having a level of equitable collaboration between nations, and how we can where we can go without a real level of notion of us all being interconnected and us all being interdependent on each other. And so I think it really needs to start that a lot of this needs to start with what is this relationship truly, and how can we actually have a more equitable relationship between nations. And so when we think about that trilateral collaboration, I think that's critical. And we have to take responsibility for the fact that in the United States in particular, I'll just speak for our own nation, that the actions of corporations are not only aided and abetted by the government, but in some ways the corporations are holding the reins in terms of our governmental action. And so when we talk about climate action, when we talk about climate policies and so forth, it can only go so far in that context. So something that's critically needed, for one thing, is to get money out of dealing money in politics, and really have a true democracy. So I want to just make those points in particular. And then I also want to say that if as we really have those relationships be on a better accord, then we as a continent need to think about making sure that we do have the mechanisms, policies in place to ensure that we are being led by the original inhabitants of these lands that we now occupy, who know the real nature-based solutions that are actually natural. We have to learn from our relatives in Mexico, who also are much closer to the real solutions, and we have to learn from Black and Brown people in the U.S. and in Canada, and who bring traditional knowledge and practices, and who embody the kind of adage that those who are closest to the problem are best placed to design the solutions. And speaking of solutions, I want to give a shout out to, in the back of the room, we have Ananda Lee Tan, who has a publication that I would invite folks to check out, Hoodwinked in the Hot House, to help us to really illuminate what real solutions are and what false solutions are. Because I know we've been talking about a mix of them today. So those are some of the things that I would put forward in terms of us really having trilateral collaboration that's built on principles of equity and justice. So thank you.
Yeah. Javier, please. Yeah.
El global, una agenda de
Okay,
cooperación.
so North American agenda needs to recognize two things. Yes, we are three countries with a shared environment, but the three countries have very different capacities to tackle the challenges. Mexico is the one that has contributed the least to environmental issues and the one that has the least resources to face climate change. So if we do not recognize that at a global scale, we will not be able to move forward in a way that will recognize this inequality. Now, at a national level, maybe this is going to be a sensitive issue coming from the Mexican history in the 19th century. We were invaded by the US, by France, twice, and then a third time by the United States. We have a tradition that has been invaded on, and they have taken some of our land. So we created some legal instruments that prevent us from getting in debt with international mechanisms. We have that fear that we will be invaded. And of course, that's being a stopper of international cooperation. The fact that we cannot get in debt with international financial mechanisms is making us lose access to technical cooperation, because that happens related to some bank funds, and that means a change in our constitution. That needs to be a consensus from the political forces, because nowadays the country is not getting a lot of added value from the World Bank, the IDB, and we need that at the subnational level mainly. That is a big limitation we need to change, and to change Mexico's constitutions. Regarding potential benefits of working together, of course, they are a lot, but the main challenge I see is that working together would not recognize the asymmetries. We are very asymmetric countries, and we see that when we take a step in our country, as we heard in the border. It's not the same to come into the US as Mexican or than to come as an American to Canada. There's a lot of differences in methodologies and many things, and we have very difficult and different contexts. And that's not the only model. I insist that the model that we need to continue building on is the top to bottom. To look at the southeast, look at our indigenous peoples and how they manage the land. It's not said a lot, but in the southeast, properties are social, they're not public or private. Most of the Mexican land is an ejido, ruled by collective mechanisms to make decisions on the land. We need to reinforce and recover that. And the way to do that, it's not only to look upwards, but maybe to look to the south and southeast of our country. And how can we get an engagement? I think that what is being done here is fundamental. I think we're lacking a network of North American communities or cities, and we can identify specific projects that will give us a new look to the territory, like Los Laredos. It's a border city where we have 60% of international trade. It goes through Nuevo Laredo in the state of Tamaulipas. Now, thinking about dreams and utopia, we're trying to build the first urban park that will be binational, where people can coexist. People from the two sides of the border and coexist with people from the two countries. So thinking of those types of projects, binational parks at the border that will give us a new look. We're standing on the same territory. I think that we need to build projects like that. So we have an idea that we can finally have a border that will not be based on control and security, but on our relationships, our culture, our capacity to coexist, being the same as people.
I would just double down on what we've heard here, like these mutual purpose projects. Working together is how we get to know each other. It's how we find out and share values and exchange information. Projects like the Monarch Conservation, these are big, high-profile projects where we can all share values and work together. And so the council has those examples, and they can always encourage them. But like, if you don't show up on issues of dignity, when my country's putting people in cages and you don't have a voice, who cares what you think? Show up for people. If you're not going to be in leadership, you don't get to sit in the back and talk about electric vehicles. But I will say, it's really easy to see who missed out on the last wealth creating boom in North America. We know what communities were left out, and those communities are all three nations, right? And so define communities by like characteristics, not absurd geographies or 19th century lines on the map. People who share something in common. So like in California, for example, found all the white gold lithium down in Imperial Valley. The folks that pull it out should be the folks that benefit from it. You're going to take it out of their neighborhood, they should own it. They should own it from manufacture. The communities that use it in heavy duty trucks and vehicles, they should own those trucks. They should own those charging stations, and recycling should go right back. We don't need another venture capitalist to come in and get rich off of something that's going to save our lives. So back to your point about the asymmetries of wealth, remember this, WTF, where's the finance? Where's the finance? Then we'll take somebody seriously when they talk to people that have all the coin. Why should Mexico have to work harder to earn back what other countries took from it? And my country, right? We know where the money is. I work in communities of color with immigrant communities, and they come to the United States and they work their butts off. And they think their job is to work hard and be good and follow the rules and do their best and that they'll win America. That's not how we win America, is it? No, you win America by taking power when you get it. So let's be honest about how we got where we're at. And equity looks like helping folks that need the most help. And you know, it's the right thing to do, but if that doesn't move you, it'll also make you safe and make you rich too.
Deborah, any perspectives from a continental view or from a local view to the continental in terms of mechanisms or opportunities?
So we're talking about the national governments and I guess the provincial, state, and local governments, but where are the indigenous governments in this conversation? And how does this all fit together? In Canada, we are now legally committed to implementing the declaration. There are specific articles in that declaration about decision making and involvement in decision making. And I think this is too big a topic, of course, to to really approach here. But just to say, like, this is, I don't see how you can have these conversations in isolation.
Take a moment and comment upon the fact that yesterday we heard from Miles Richardson, told us the really incredible story about the resistance of the people of Haida Gwaii to the circumstances that they were facing 20 plus years ago, and how they came together and dealt with that. And in that case, Matt, it wasn't lithium that they were sitting on; it was trees. It was resources, and it wasn't ejido lands. It was crown land, or as the settlers like to call it, crown land. It's native land, it's indigenous territory. And through a process of assertion of sovereignty and control, local mobilization, community, and ultimately collaboration with people that had otherwise been defined as the enemy or as opponents, have crafted a solution, a constitution, governance structures, and all of the things that go with that. So in some ways, Miles should have been a participant here, because I think the experience that we saw and heard of yesterday with respect to the a specific and unique, perhaps indigenous approach to resource management, governance, and development is very instructive, taken to the continental level. And I think, unbeknownst to us, perhaps we've taken that sort of topic and integrated into this, but I think it is something that we should certainly remind our federal counterparts of.
Can I just, it's not poetry to give land back to indigenous people that ran things well for 15,000 years. We're in California for like a half an afternoon, everything's on fire. Giving land back to people to use traditional ecological knowledge for managing a place is a super shrewd, selfish thing to do. You don't even have to feel good about yourself for doing it. You should do it.
Are we done for time? Are we just about done? In terms of time, you're okay. All right, so with that, do we have any outstanding questions from the floor that have been come in? We have one? I think we have time for one very quick intervention, very quick, because we have to wrap up. 1 minute, please.
So you might not be able to answer my question, but I'm going to bring up the thought anyways. So last night you heard from the mayor from the city of Victoria, area I call Petulia. She was saying you could have...
Approach the mic, please. Yep.
You can have a vote in how things happen here. It's not true. I live on reserve. I'm status Indian. I do not vote in any local elections. I do not vote for city council, for mayor, for the school district people. I am not allowed. That's one inequity you can change. The other part is, and if you're going to talk about ownership, it's all at the side, and thank you for your Crown land understanding, is that it's not necessarily the people who are presently on that space, because we were shuffled to the side. Example is that castle building over there was Songhees. That was valuable. They shuffled them there. Then they went them down to Esquimalt. Not cool. Not cool. But we're all talking about humans. The part that's missing, and they tried to share it last night and it's still a flyby. So I'm going to bring it up. If we can still be othering other beings, and you're only talking about humans right now, it means you still have the opportunity to feel more valuable, more superior than something else. And if you allow that, you allow the seed of possibility for not being respectful. We're on all of this that is supporting us here today. This came from somewhere. It came from a precious inside our sacred mother, came from above, came from the water, wherever it came from. You value that a lot less. You throw it away. Just the same as you value a tree because it has money that it will put in your pocket, or salmon because it only will put money in your pocket. When Miss COVID came in, and I'm saying it this way because you need to understand that was a new relative. Did you figure out how to have protocol with that new relative? We have forgotten how to be intercultural. We are nation to nation to nation, not just what you have 3 boundaries here. That's not it. You see, last night that was Quagus, that was Heltuk, and that was Nuchanath, and that was Salish, Kosalish. That was nations. Do you see how they showed you the example of how to work together? Same thing needs to happen here. For the eagle, for the whale, for the tree of all kinds, tree of life. That is our relative. We, in our creation stories, and I'm sure you all have it in your background somewhere in your own DNA, wherever your DNA came from originally, you have a connection to all the beings that were there. You just have not listened or brought it into your heart or brought it into action because it's not important. It needs to become important. How can you do that?
Thank you for bringing us back. I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our panel this morning. Obviously, there's more discussion to occur, and thank you very much for your participation, everyone here, as well as online. I can assure you that any questions that we've received online will be answered. Danielle has given us his assurance in that regard. JPAC will be reporting out, and of course, as I mentioned, there will be an attempt to consolidate and communicate some of the discussion that we've had this morning with our ministers this afternoon. So thank you very, very much.